It's been called the greatest poltergeist case in Scottish history, and it centers around an 11-year-old girl haunted not only in her home, but this thing follows her to school. A story that left doctors, ministers, teachers, and even skeptics stunned. You see, in 1960, the quiet Scottish town of Sauchie became the stage for a paranormal extravaganza that was so extraordinary that some experts have described it as undeniable proof of poltergeist activity. Tonight we dive into the chilling events of the Sauchie Poltergeist, exploring Malcolm Robinson's gripping investigation. Malcolm is a lifelong paranormal researcher and investigator. He was only 3 years old at the time of the case, but he lived only a few miles away. And so, unsurprisingly, as he grew up, Sauchie captured his imagination, especially when a member of his own family saw the activity for herself. Since then, he has carried out extensive research, including detailed interviews with multiple witnesses who still confirm today that something absolutely insane was happening in Sauchie back in 1960, a case that still mystifies and terrifies decades later. Not only that, we will explore later cases from 1969 and 2020 that suggest that the paranormal force may not have been emanating from the girl of the house, like so many said at the time, but perhaps even from the street itself. What really happened? And was something sinister following 11-year-old Virginia Campbell? Join me as we uncover the truly chilling case of the Sauchie Poltergeist. The remarkable events began in 1960, and they centered on the Campbell family. The Campbells had been living in a coastal town of Moville in County Donegal in Ireland. The parents, James and Nanny Campbell, lived on the family farm, and they had raised 8 children there. But by 1960, they were both in their mid-50s, and so all but one of their children had moved out. And that just left their youngest, a shy 11-year-old girl called Virginia. Virginia enjoyed it there. She loved playing with her friend Anna and her beloved dog Toby. But life was hard as a farming family. In the early 1960s, many small-scale farmers in rural Ireland were struggling, and they faced significant economic challenges. Yes, by the late 1960s, the Irish would introduce financial assistance and grants for small farmers, but this was 1960. That was too far off. Farming families could only ever rely on the farm's income, which was becoming less and less. So I can't be certain, but I'm pretty sure that must be the reason why the Campbells decided to sell up and move not only house, but country. You see, one of their sons, Thomas, had moved over to Scotland. He was working in the coal mines there. He lived in the village of Sauchie. That word, Sauchie, by the way, means the place or field of the willows. And so, in November of 1960, Annie and young Virginia left Ireland and moved in with Thomas and his family in Scotland. The dad, James, stayed back in Ireland for a while with the dog so he could oversee the sale of the farm. So you can already see that Virginia's life had become very unsettled and complicated. She'd left her home in Ireland, her friend, her dog, her dad. This can't have been easy for her. And now she and her mum were living with Thomas, his wife Isabella, plus their 2 young children, Margaret, aged 9, and Derek, aged 6. Virginia was their aunt, and they're all in the same house. Not only that, but Virginia's mum, Annie, quickly started to work in a boarding house in the nearby town of Dollar. This job offered accommodation, so mum was often out of the house, which left Virginia in the care of Annie's brother and wife. Hope you're keeping track of all this. It was a bit of a squeeze in at home. 6-year-old Derek had his own bedroom, but Virginia had to share not only a room, but a bed with her niece, Margaret. Well, the Campbells made the best of it in the first weeks of November, and eventually the dad, James, did sell the farm and moved to Sauchie to be with them. However, what they did not expect was that that house was way more crowded than anybody could have possibly imagined. You see, there was something else living in the house with them, and it began to make itself known later that month with knocking sounds. Virginia and her niece Margaret were lying in bed trying to get to sleep. It was 10:30 p.m., but while they lay there, they started to hear an odd noise in the room, a sort of thudding. In the diary written at the time, they recorded this noise as sounding like a ball bouncing on the floor. Now, Virginia's aunt and uncle were in the house. They were sitting downstairs. Uncle Thomas shouted up to the kids to be quiet and go to sleep. When the two girls said they couldn't because of the strange noises, Thomas told them they were imagining it and to get back to bed and sleep. But they couldn't, because as they lay there, this eerie thudding sound got louder and louder, to the point that the two girls leapt out of bed thinking they must have a mouse in the room, and so they came rushing down the stairs to say so.
How are you, and welcome to the White Heather Club, which comes to you direct from Scotland.
But as they hurried down the staircase, the sound of this bouncing ball followed them. It sounded like, they said, like someone was bouncing a large ball on every single step as it came down after them. And yet there was nothing behind them to make the sound. Virginia and Margaret burst into the living room in a state of total confusion. They said something was in the room and it is now chasing us through the house. Thomas and Isabella told the kids to go straight back to bed. But the aunt and uncle were caring and they went up to tuck them in, to check under the bed to see if there really was a mouse after all. Thomas and Isabella probably said something like, "Now, go to sleep, you two, everything's okay, good night." And they switched out the light and closed the door and left them in the darkness. But at that very moment, the latch caught. They too heard the sound of thumping from inside the kids' bedroom. They immediately swung the door open to see what was going on. Perhaps to catch the two girls smacking a fist against the wall in some sort of prank. They weren't. You see, when Thomas and Isabella entered the room, they could hear the banging as clear as day. And they could tell that this thumping was coming from the headboard of the bed. And yet both girls had their arms clearly and firmly underneath the covers. Just picture that for a second. A simple yet terrifying scenario of a clear knocking on a piece of wood right in front of you, but nobody's doing it. Try it out. Just find something next to you and knock on it hard with your knuckles. And now imagine hearing that same sound, but your knuckles aren't there to make it. No wonder that both Thomas and Isabella scooped those two girls up and rushed them into the other bedroom of the house. But as the girls lay in that room, the knocking came again. But then that sound gradually seemed to fade when, as Virginia fell asleep. You have to remember that Virginia had only just moved to the area, so she hadn't started to attend the local school yet, but she was due to. However, last night had been so strange and had such an effect on her that the family decided to keep Virginia off school that day and would delay her start for the term. And it appears that nothing unusual happened that day until the early evening. The whole family was sitting in the living room together. Virginia was relaxing in an armchair by what you might call a dining room cabinet. In the UK, some people call it a sideboard. Well, listen to this. They were all just sitting there when all of a sudden, the substantially sized cabinet started to move. Nobody was touching it, and yet it slowly started to move away from the wall, as if someone was just gently sliding it out of the way. It moved away from the wall about 5 inches. Now, let me just get my tape measure to help you appreciate how significant that is. This is 5 inches from there to there. That's a significant distance. If you're in a room now, just look at a piece of furniture, and yes, if something had been shifted a millimeter, you wouldn't be a big deal. But 5 inches, that's a decent amount to be away from the wall. They all looked at this with total astonishment. But then this cabinet simply slid back into place neatly against the wall, all in front of their eyes. Watch out for this in this case, by the way the presence seems to put the things back after messing with them. Well, Virginia was near to this cabinet, and so skeptics might think she's reached out and grabbed it somehow. With her hand, maybe, or her foot. But the room was full of witnesses who insisted she didn't touch it at all. It had moved on its own accord. When that was done, the knocking sounds returned, only now they started battering through the house. So loudly, in fact, that the next door neighbors heard the banging too. Well, the sounds died away again, and later the girls were sent up to bed. And Thomas and Isabella were in no doubt. Something utterly inexplicable was happening in their home. And so that very night, they got in touch with the local Church of Scotland minister. This was a man called Reverend T. Waterton Lund, and he was from Sauchie Parish Church. Now, Lund was a popular presence in Sauchie. He'd recently overseen the erection of a new church hall, and so they wanted to put on events for young people and old in the community. So it appears that Lund was keen to be involved in the life of Sauchie and the surrounding areas. So when he got the call from the Campbells that night, he said he would immediately attend. And he arrived at number 19 Park Crescent just before midnight. He found a house full, because 8 of the neighbors in the street, all adults, had now come in to support the family and to see what was going on. It was really quite a commotion. Reverend Lund sat with the Campbells and listened to them share what exactly had happened to cause all of this fuss. While this was happening, the house was normal and quiet. And so it seems sensible for Reverend Lund to want to experience this activity for himself. And so they took him upstairs to where the 2 girls were. Later, Reverend Lund would share his experience with a BBC radio program called Scope. He said he was going up the stairs when he started to hear the distinct sound of knocking, and he could tell that somewhere in the girls' room, something wooden was being rapped against. So these knocks were obviously of a pretty decent volume for him to hear it way down on the stairs. And then he gently opened the bedroom door and saw an odd sight. Various neighbors were sitting in the room already, standing watch over Virginia, who was alone in her bed. Margaret was no longer lying next to her. She was lying in another bed that had been placed in the room. Virginia wasn't asleep, of course. How could she sleep with all of these people watching? But then there was the knocking that would keep anybody awake. Reverend Lund stood there in the hushed, uneasy quiet of that room, listening to the repeated banging on the headboard of the bed. Since Virginia was awake, Reverend Lund wondered if, well, quite rightly, could Virginia be making these thumping sounds herself? So he asked her to shimmy herself down the bed so that her head wasn't touching the headboard. You know what happens if she was like nutting it back like this? She did as she was asked and was well away from the wood, and yet the knocking kept going. He wondered if the board was simply banging against the wall, perhaps, maybe the shaking of the bed. That would explain everything. But he checked, and it was not touching the wall in the slightest. And so he decided to place his hands on the wood, and I think that might have been when the shivers really came. He could feel the vibrations of knocking against his skin. Virginia understandably started to become visibly upset at this point. I wonder if Reverend Lund showed his shock. This might have been a very disturbing sight to see the respected figure of religious authority standing in that room in fear and bafflement. Seeing that was a horrible confirmation that this was happening, and it was even beyond the vicar's understanding. But it got worse, because as they all stood there in that crowded room, something else started which was insane and freaky. It was a moment in which reality tilted. The others got the Reverend's attention so that he turned to see what was going on. There was a chest in that bedroom. They used it for sheets and linen. It weighed about 50 pounds. If you're not sure how heavy that is, it's about the weight of a couple of car tires. So not hugely heavy, but certainly not lightweight. This 50-pound chest started to rock back and forth in what Lund described as spasmodic little jerks. And then, to their absolute astonishment, it started to move. The direction, well, this piece of furniture was now starting to creep towards the bed, towards Virginia. It was so erratic that this thing almost toppled over. It traveled about 18 inches along the floor. Let's see how far that is. 18 inches. This far. From here all the way along to here. And they all just watched this in a mixture of awe and terror as it jerked towards Virginia in the bed. And Virginia at this point was absolutely hysterical, bless her. She was terrified. This moment was frightening enough for the people in the room. But to think you were the focus of it, the desire of it, that you are tethered somehow to an unseen force, it's horrifying. So as the chest moved towards Virginia, she was in full-blown panic. From the looks of the records, it seems that she had leapt out of bed at this point. I would have too. Heck, I might have been tempted to leap out of the window to get away. But then this chest did the same as the cabinet did last night. It came to a stop, and then it reversed its track, and it jerked and wobbled itself back the 18 inches into the correct position. The Reverend spoke with classic British understatement when he said,
I saw it move about 18 inches and move back again, which was certainly very strange to say the least. So I put my hand on the box to see if I could feel any pressure, of which the movement stopped at once.
The neighbour and the Reverend decided to drag that chest out of the bedroom, and they placed it on the landing. And so the Reverend tried his best to calm and comfort both her and the others in the room. He prayed for Virginia and for the family, and then he tried to lighten the mood. He said all this knocking was probably just Virginia's boyfriend trying to get attention. Now, personally, if I was a kid, the suggestion that this disturbing presence wanted me romantically would have freaked me out even more. But apparently his joke made people laugh in the room and seemed to break some of the tension. And so he convinced Virginia to get back into the bed. And as the mood started to calm somewhat, the vicar managed to convince Margaret to get back into bed too. At that point, the room erupted in violent, angry knocking. Markham suggests that whatever was making that sound appeared furious that Margaret had climbed into the bed with Virginia, or at least tried to sleep in the same room as her. This is a chilling idea, as if it wanted Virginia all for itself. Well, eventually the knocking died away, and somehow the girls managed to let their physical and emotional exhaustion take over, and they fell asleep. The activity continued the next day. They owned some vases made of china, for example, and on that Thursday they started moving by themselves. Also remember that I said that the dad, James, was now living with them. Well, he noticed a commotion in a bowl of fruit. He saw an apple rise up from it multiple times, as if an invisible hand was plucking it upwards. An impossible sight, and yet there it was. James also witnessed the sewing machine in the house just suddenly start by itself without anybody touching it. Well, the Reverend was clearly worried about the family, and he could tell this was no joke because he came back the next day to check how they were doing. He had seen the impossible with his own eyes, with multiple witnesses around him, and so he knew this wasn't in people's head, this was actually happening. And so when he came over the next evening, he invited 2 doctors to come with him. One was a doctor called W.H. Nisbet. He was also a Baptist lay preacher. That's a person who can preach in local churches but isn't ordained. The other doctor's name was Dr. Logan. And Lund also invited another church minister. Well, Reverend Lund got up there into the room first, and he went to check on Virginia. She was lying in the bed, in the small bed this time, not the main one where everything had been happening, and she was trying to fall asleep. Well, what happened that night was even more bizarre. You see, he could hear some subdued knocking. But as Virginia lay there with her head on the pillow, and let me grab a pillow to show you what happened. With her head on a pillow like this, he started to see the pillow move. And I don't mean it was dragged out from under her. I meant he went on record to say that with his own eyes, he saw that pillow start to turn like this. And he said it rotated about 50 degrees. I mean, all the while she is sleeping with her head on it, not touching it, and it's just revolving under her head. Well, that calmed down, and then the other people arrived who he'd invited, the 2 doctors and the other minister. They trekked up the stairs to join him in the room. They put everyone else out of the room, all the other witnesses, and just the 4 men sat there waiting for something to happen. This must have been an incredibly awkward experience for Virginia. She's 11 years old. She's got 4 kind of random blokes just sitting around her bed, watching and waiting. Men who she didn't know because, she'd only moved to the place a few weeks before. And they're waiting for something to occur. Well, nothing did. After a while, Dr. Logan and the other vicar decided they'd had enough and they left. They were quite skeptical at that point. But Dr. Nesbitt and Reverend Lund stuck around. Was the presence waiting for the other people to go? I don't know. But once those other 2 left the house, the linen chest, which was now back in the room, the one that had moved, that started rocking and moving again. And the lid even started to open as if invisible hands were lifting it and letting it fall. Lund made a point to say,
"And all along we had taken what precautions we could to make sure that the girl herself was not instrumental in this. And on the first night, I had seen that her head was away from the head of the bed, that she couldn't possibly be knocking on it with her own head. And I had seen that her hands were out of the bedclothes, and that she wasn't knocking on her bed herself. And I seen that her feet were closely tucked in, as she couldn't possibly be pushing the linen basket."
Yet there it was, moving. As well as the knocking sounds, they also heard the sound of sawing. Somebody like sawing wood. And if this wasn't enough, the doctor and the reverend both witnessed an incredibly weird moment. It was the bed covers. They saw a rippling movement, like a wave of water, only it spread up and down her bed covers as she lay there. At this point, her covers were tightly up to her chin, so neither man felt that the girl was doing this. The 2 men left the house on Park Crescent that night, thoroughly shaken. Well, even after just a few nights of activity, the events were dramatic enough to already have been an emotional and physical drain on the family. But of course, the real pressure had been on Virginia herself, who appeared to be the focus of this anomalous phenomenon. So, they had kept Virginia off school at this point, and yet they started to wonder if actually maybe Virginia needed to go into school. It might give her a bit of space from this house, a rest from the intensity, the insanity. So as they went to bed on that Thursday, they decided that they would send Virginia into school the next day. They thought it would get her away for a while. Their belief was entirely misplaced, because whatever was going on in that house followed her to class. Virginia was set to attend Sauchie Primary School, which was only about a quarter of a mile away. And that Friday, Virginia finally stepped out of that house and began the short walk, 5 or 6 minutes at most, to her school. I wonder what her thoughts were, if they drifted back to Ireland as she went, to the quiet rural farm she'd called home just a month ago. Yet here she was now, her feet encased in new school shoes, treading not on grass or meadows, but on cold concrete streets. Streets that hadn't just marked the upheaval of moving house, but had brought a far heavier weight of stress, unease, and fear. Well, thankfully, her first day appeared to go well. The only challenge seemed to have been that her teacher, a woman called Margaret Stewart, struggled to understand Virginia's strong Irish accent. And apart from that, though, the first day was good, but only to a point, because the goodness wouldn't last. Virginia was sitting in class with around 40 other pupils. Yes, classes were pretty big back then. Picture this. When I was at school, we always just had desks, like bog standard desks. But I do remember seeing in old films how school kids would have like a desktop that would have a lid, like a lift. You could lift it on a hinge. And that was so kids could put their pens, pencils, paper inside. It's actually a pretty nifty idea. And so all of the pupils at the school, they had these desks with lids. Well, Virginia's teacher, Miss Stewart, had given the class some writing work. They had an essay to complete. And the teacher looked up from her work to check how everyone was getting on with the assignment. Every head was down, pens feverishly scraping away, except one pupil. Virginia. Miss Stewart frowned. Not only was Virginia not writing, she was pressing her hands down onto the desk like this, and it seemed like she was messing around. It looked like she was wobbling the desk around under her hands. Well, Mrs. Stewart caught Virginia's gaze, glared at her, and called out, "Virginia, what are you doing?" This poor girl looked back at the teacher and said desperately, "Nothing, miss." Miss Stewart was not satisfied. Clearly, this new girl was doing something odd to the desk because it looked like it was starting to rise up. Miss Stewart assumed that this new girl was causing a scene by pushing her knees up under the desk to lift it, So the teacher called out, again, only much more sternly this time, "Stop that at once, Virginia!" What else could she do? Virginia had been trying to contain and stop the activity that had horribly followed her to school. Now she's been accused of misbehaving. The only thing she could do, she lifted her arms off the desk, which is when the desktop lid began flapping up and down like a wild mouth. I know this sounds like something from a horror movie or some made-up story from an internet forum, but this was witnessed by multiple people who would go on record to say they saw it. The teacher and a bunch of pupils. In fact, the room erupted in screams, and Miss Stewart just stared at this with her jaw hanging. The movement in the desk eventually died down, and then everything seemed normal again. Now, what was the teacher supposed to do? Send everybody home? She didn't. Once the peace was resumed, she figured it was best to get the kids thinking of something else, so she carried on teaching the class their next topic. Things seemed okay, but not for long, because there was a girl who sat behind Virginia's desk. And at one point, she put her hand up to say, this was the other girl, put her hand up to say that she had a library book and she wanted to ask Miss Stewart if she might get permission to take that library book back to the school library. And so this girl stood up from her desk and walked towards the teacher, walked past Virginia. What happened next was crazy, and it was proof that Virginia was not causing her own desk to rise with her legs or anything. Listen to this. As the girl walked forward, the teacher looked up and was amazed to see the girl's empty desk, the one behind Virginia, was starting to gradually rise off the floor, and its lid was lifting up. I know how crazy this sounds. I am literally only telling you what the multiple witnesses said they saw. It was moving very slowly, rising about an inch, and then the desk very gently replaced itself back on the floor again. Miss Stewart rose from her chair. With a deep breath, she walked towards that empty desk to see if she could figure out what on earth had just happened. The desk looked totally normal. She couldn't work it out. So Miss Stewart returned to her desk at the front, but as she did, she passed Virginia, who was sitting in front. She leaned in and asked, "Are you feeling better, Virginia?" To which Virginia said, quite rightly, "There's nothing wrong with me, Miss Stewart." The more you read the details of this case, the more respect you get, the more I have of Virginia. She was just going through stress upon stress, but she showed an inspiring level of resilience. Well, in 1994, Malcolm Robinson managed to track down the phone number of Miss Margaret Stewart, the teacher who saw these events in her class. And in the book, he extensively quotes a phone call with Miss Stewart, who by the 90s was called Mrs. Davidson. She confirmed that these surely impossible events actually did happen. She said that after the other pupil's desk rose, Miss Stewart rushed to see the headmaster. He was called Mr. Peter Hill, and she explained to him what she had just seen. And interestingly, the headmaster said that he had already been hearing rumors that weird things were happening in the Campbell house. And after hearing this wild report, he told Miss Stewart to go back to the class and to send Virginia to see him. But while she was gone, he instructed Miss Stewart that she should address this situation directly with the entire class. And he told her she should acknowledge that the kids will have heard rumors about ghosts being near to Virginia, but he told her to tell them that they shouldn't believe that. Instead, she was to tell them that Virginia was feeling a little unwell, and rather than fear or shock, this little girl just needed everybody's support. That's what she needed the most right now, which is actually a really kind way to approach this, to make sure that Virginia wasn't isolated or demonized. And so Miss Stewart returned to the class and asked Virginia to go and see Mr. Hill. Virginia did. But as she went to leave the classroom, Miss Stewart was shocked to find that she couldn't close the classroom door. It was as if someone was holding it open. In that phone call in 1994, she told Robinson that she had to call 3 children in her class to help her pull that door shut. And then, with Virginia gone, Miss Stewart spoke to the class about Virginia needing all the support and understanding, and she told Robinson that the kids were actually brilliant, and that as scary as it was, they just all wanted to be there for Virginia. I just love that. Now, at this stage, you might assume that the poltergeist activity had followed Virginia to school, and so in theory, the house would have been quiet. But it wasn't. You see, weird happenings were still going on during that first school day without her even being there. Reverend Lund returned, as did the doctor from last night, Dr. Nisbet, who had come to visit the house again, and he witnessed the linen chest moving by itself again, as well as the bed covers rippling up and down. Later that day, Reverend Lund popped in to see how Virginia was doing and how her first day of school went. He was worried about her, and so she told him. And it just probably made him worry even more. The events at school had happened on the Friday, and there was to be more activity over the weekend. On Saturday, for example, it was mostly quiet. Apart from the pillow under Virginia's head, it rotated again. The rippling was back on the bed cover. Then on Sunday, it was a bit more troubling because at that point, Virginia seemed to phase out, like she was going into some kind of trance. And when she did, she turned hysterical again. She started calling out for things that couldn't possibly be there, like her friend from Ireland, Anna. The poor girl was just desperate to connect with a friend who made her feel safe and at home. But other than that, the weekend was relatively quiet. But then things got even more intense back at school on Monday. Something would happen that Miss Stewart would describe as the most unnerving thing of them all. Well, by Monday, Virginia was back at school, and during one of her lessons, she got up to hand in an essay that she'd been working on. Again, huge respect to this girl. In the midst of this insane week, when she'd only just started school on the Friday, she was still trying to do her best with her schoolwork. She's an amazing kid. So she rose from her school desk and walked to Miss Stewart's desk down front. She handed her essay in. And at that moment, they both heard a weird rattling sound. There was a long wooden cane that was used to point out things on the blackboard. It was lying across Miss Stewart's desk, and they both stared at this cane in disbelief, as if it was like vibrating. And then it suddenly shifted and then fell off and cracked onto the classroom floor. And when it did that, the vibration seemed to move into the desk. Miss Stewart saw this so clearly that she slapped both hands down on the desk, and she said she could feel the vibrations coming up through the wood and through into her body. I know this sounds nuts, but this is precisely what the eyewitnesses saw. And then came what Miss Stewart had described as the most unnerving thing that I experienced in the classroom.
At first it vibrated slowly and then increased as the seconds wore on. I sat transfixed looking at this. And the table, which was quite heavy, started to rise up slowly into the air and also vibrated. I put my hands on the table and tried to push it back down, but with no success. I was quite horrified, but it didn't stop there. The table continued to vibrate as it hovered a few inches off the floor. Then the table rotated through 90 degrees, so that where I had moments before sat behind the long edge of the table had rotated so that its narrow edge was now directly in front of my stomach. I looked up at Virginia and saw that she was quite distressed.
The children saw this and screamed. They were leaping from their chairs and racing to the door to get out. One of the children was Malcolm Robinson's cousin, June Robinson. Remember, he lived nearby, but he was too young for school at the time. Well, she confirmed with him that she saw the cane vibrate, rise, and fall over, and she also confirmed that the teacher's desk genuinely did lift and turn and move. When this happened, Virginia just burst into tears, and through her sobs, she kept saying to the teacher, "Miss, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. Honestly, it's not me." The desk stopped. Miss Stewart had compassion on her. She said, "Virginia, it's all right. Just help me straighten up my desk." trying to be fine, when inside she was in shock. In that phone call, Miss Stewart told Robinson that she saw other activity too. She saw school books rising from desks and moving away from Virginia. She also mentioned that this strange activity seemed to occur roughly once a month, and then it would die away and return again. This was as the situation went on, but that was later. Let's get back to the initial outbreak when everything was at its worst. Word of this activity had reached a university lecturer called Allan Robert George Owen. I know that just sounds like a list of 4 random men, but no, that was his full name. He was a geneticist and mathematician, and he had an avid interest in the paranormal. In late November or early December of 1960, he came to visit the Campbell house and interviewed 5 different witnesses. He was a skeptic in such matters, but he was very impressed by the consistent testimony of those 5 people. He said,
"These were 5 in number, professional people whose contact with the family had previously been very remote or non-existent. I then realized that I had stumbled on a scientific treasure beyond price, incontrovertible testimony as to the reality of poltergeist phenomena."
Later, he would learn more about the case, looking into Virginia's medical history. For example, he made sure there was no history of hallucinations. He also checked the atmospheric conditions of the house to make sure there was no substance, like a chemical perhaps, that was causing delusions. He even checked into the geology around Park Crescent, in case seismic activity had caused the earth tremors. He would write a book in 1964 called Can We Explain the Poltergeist? And in it he wrote,
"In my opinion, the Sauchie case must be regarded as establishing beyond all reasonable doubt the objective reality of some poltergeist phenomena."
He felt that this wasn't the work of a separate entity, but that the power was coming from Virginia herself in a supernatural way, sparked by her stress from moving from Ireland, as well as going through puberty. Well, for now, a whole week of horrible experiences had worn Virginia down. So after school, it was decided that Virginia needed a rest from this, even if she had to miss school. She would go on to stay in the nearby town of Dollar. That's because one of her aunts lived there. Remember, that's where her mum worked too, at the boarding house. It's about 6 miles from Sauchie. So Virginia stayed there for a while, but it didn't make much difference, because even in Dollar, a strange knocking was heard throughout the auntie's house while she was there. And as Malcolm Robinson puts it in his book, he says, the Campbell family were at their wits' end. And so when Thursday came around, they decided that something had to be done. They didn't want to call it an exorcism. It would be a spiritual intervention. It was Thursday night when the family welcomed the visitors to the house for a service of prayer and intercession. Once again, the local doctor was present, Dr. Nisbet. He brought a colleague, Dr. William Logan. Robinson would later interview Dr. Logan on Valentine's Day 1994. The doctor confirmed that he really did see paranormal phenomena in the house, including seeing the bed covers make that weird rippling movement that he assured Robinson could not have been produced by Virginia herself. Listen to this. Logan even said that at one point he saw the green bed covers turning red. He noticed something really frightening with the pillow as well. It didn't revolve this time, but rather did this.
Well, seconds later, I then observed the pillow next to Virginia, which had been plumped up, suddenly take on what appeared to me to the shape of someone's head. A clear indentation of the pillow was seen by myself and others in the room.
That image is terrifying, of this presence lying down so close to this little girl that they shared the same pillow. Well, on that Thursday, the 2 doctors brought along a cine camera and an audio tape recorder. They wanted to record the phenomena in action. That recording does actually exist, but it's being held by the BBC, who broadcast it as part of their radio show. Sadly, I don't have permission to share it with you here, but it does exist, and Malcolm has heard it too. And he's working on a documentary about this case, so I do hope that he might be able to get that audio cleared for that too, and possibly even the cine film footage. But the focus that night for this blessing was on Reverend Lund, who returned along with 2 more Church of Scotland ministers. It was around 11 p.m. that they began to carry out a service of prayer and blessing. Now, this was a different approach to exorcism. The clue in the word exorcism is ex, which is where you get words like exit, explode, or extra. The ex means out. If something is out of the ordinary, we call it extraordinary. So an exorcism is a ritual designed to drive out a malevolent demonic presence. Lund wasn't planning that. He wanted to carry out a service of blessing on the house, a way to shift the atmosphere, so to speak. They weren't casting things out as much as inviting the peace of God in. So he did that. And they walked from room to room, offering prayers of blessing and God's presence. During this, the knocking started up again. And so the church folk began singing, "The Lord's my shepherd," as they went. Years later, a researcher called Brian Allen was able to interview Dr. Logan about that very night. When asked about the sounds, Logan gave an interesting detail about them. Years later, he eventually heard these same noises in a very different scenario. This is fascinating. Dr. Logan, later in his life, had to have a scan in an MRI scanner. Well, as Dr. Logan lay there inside the scanner, it was like being cast back to that frightening night in 1960, because he said the sounds were incredibly similar to what they heard in the Campbell house that night. So similar, in fact, that it made the doctor wonder if some sort of complex magnetic field anomaly was going on in the house to cause all of the activity. Well, back in 1960, during the prayer session, Virginia went into a trance. She started making weird babbling noises. Now, an interesting point here. Dr. Logan told Malcolm Robinson that he had heard that animals were capable of sensing danger or presence. I'm sure all of us have heard that. Earthquakes, animals can tell they're coming, that sort of thing. So he actually brought his own dog along to the house to test the theory. He was fascinated to see that while the humans in the home could all clearly hear the sound of knocking and rapping, the dog was totally oblivious to it. Well, the 2 doctors recorded the sawing, knocking, and rasping sounds of the house on the tape recorder, and they were so startling that, like I said, a local BBC radio station broadcast them on their program called Scope. And that's why the BBC have the tape. Now, this service of blessing did seem to work in the sense that the activity calmed down after it. And it was decided that on that night, it would be a good idea to now get the word out that the situation had been fully resolved. They wanted, for Virginia's sake, to do this because after the events at the school, the word was out that she was the center of a frightening paranormal outbreak. And though the activity did reduce, it didn't end. It was the day after the prayer service, and while it was hoped it might bring an end to interest in the case, well, by this point the media were all over this. The local newspapers were starting to report on this haunting in Sauchie. By the way, Sauchie is in a place called Alloa, and on the 2nd of December of that year, the Alloa Journal and the Alloa Advertiser covered the story. The articles make a point of saying how convinced both Reverend Lund and Dr. Nisbet were by what they saw. The Alloa Journal, for example, quotes them as saying,
Dr. Nisbet said, "Virginia is not responsible for what has happened. The child is innocent. What has taken place was not conjured by the child herself. An outside agent is responsible. Believe me, something unfortunate has been going on in that house. The girl was hysterical all the time the phenomenon was appearing. We decided then to try sedation. Virginia was given mild tranquilizers to quieten her. The phenomena were being conjured by her own imagination. It would no longer appear if the brain was dulled. But even though the brain was not working normally, the phenomenon still appeared."
Now, at this point, because more people were aware of what was going on, they wanted to get involved. So local mediums from Alloa Spiritualist Church wanted to help. They said it would be better for a medium to come into the house and take the presence onto themselves so that Virginia didn't have to be attached to them anymore. But they also had an angle, which was to say that this girl clearly had some sort of supernatural gift, and they wanted to encourage her to use it to help others. I think, basically, they thought they were in the midst of a potential paranormal prodigy. As far as I can tell, the spiritualists didn't actually become involved in the case. It was Tuesday when the BBC broadcast the sounds of the poltergeist, recorded by the two doctors. Around this time, members of the public were getting in touch. At one point, young Margaret got a message from someone claiming to be a witch doctor in Africa. He advised her to get some bones, pound them down, and to dance over them. This, he said, would rid Virginia of the ghost. The press was also starting to hound the family, but the kids at school were helping Virginia avoid them. For example, there was a fellow classmate who looked a bit like Virginia. And one day, when some journalists were hovering at the school gates, this girl, whispered to Virginia and said, "Look, give me your coat. I'll wear it." I said, "Okay." And she rushed out of the school and hurried off in the opposite direction to Virginia's house. And the press chased after her, leaving Virginia safe to leave the school in relative peace and to go home. On the following Friday, the Alloa Journal reported on the radio broadcast from the previous Tuesday. Reverend Lund was convinced that it had somehow emanated from Virginia herself. This was an opinion shared by the teacher too, Miss Margaret Stewart, as well as Dr. Logan. They all felt that this may have been some kind of psychic phenomenon in their midst. Well, Christmas came and went, and the Campbell family began the new year, 1961. Yet while the activity had indeed reduced, considerably so, there were still very strange things occurring in Virginia's vicinity. There was still the sound of knocking for a start now and then. At one point, the family even heard what sounded like footsteps walking across the bedroom floor. Virginia and Margaret also said that they would feel occasionally the sensation of someone poking them, jabbing a finger into their bodies, despite there being no one there. Malcolm did get permission from the BBC to include a transcript of that Scope radio program, and on that there's a lot of reading from a family diary of the events. They include all manner of activity. Listen to these.
The clock came off the cabinet and hit Virginia on the nose, settling on the chair just before I came back. A piece of chocolate jumped off the sideboard. Also a pencil. A Brillo pad came out of the kitchen into the living room. The light went on twice. Virginia was using the cleaner. It went off and the rubber flew off the handle. There was a knocking under the table. Virginia gave 3 knocks, then there were 3 knocks back. Later she said nothing happened this day. There was knocking on the table at dinner time. Someone was punching the girls in bed. On another occasion, the top of the hot water bottles was open and there were scrapings. The girls were getting pinched sore. Virginia's leg was being tickled. There has been writing on the girls' faces for the past 3 nights. Virginia's lips went bright red 3 times and there was a noise like a ball bouncing.
Well, the Sauchie Poltergeist gradually faded, both from the media frenzy, but thankfully from the house itself, it appears. This case has, since then, continued to fascinate researchers, though I'm quite surprised that it's not more well-known globally. As for the house itself, in 2020, Robinson put the word out for locals in Sauchie to share their memories of the poltergeist case from 1960. He had a lot of responses from locals who confirmed being there at the time of seeing the reporters at the school gates. And various people confirmed that they had been schoolmates of Virginia, and that, yes, the desk lids had flapped on their own, and the desk had lifted on its own. One woman called Allison said that her sister Helen once went to Virginia's house for a sleepover, and on several different occasions, Helen said she saw a clear indent of a body shape lying next to Virginia in the bed. Intrigued, Malcolm Robinson called Allison on the phone and interviewed her in more depth. She said that Helen was having dinner with the Campbell family at the house one night when she saw a knife and fork next to Virginia start moving by itself as if someone was trying to eat with it. She said the family, the Campbells, just tried to ignore it and went on eating their dinner. So, what was happening at number 19 Park Crescent in 1960 and beyond? Many at the time said that they felt the paranormal events were centered on or somehow caused by Virginia Campbell herself. This would suggest that when she left the house, the strangers would leave with her. However, we've heard how it didn't do that. Indeed, Malcolm Robinson started to discover people who had lived in the house after Virginia had left, long after, and it appeared that they too had experienced disturbing phenomena there. For example, Nicola Bernard, who emailed Malcolm on the 27th of February 2020.
Hi Malcolm, yes, I lived there around about 2003 with my two boys, Michael, who was 2 at the time, and John, who was 3 at the time. They shared the back bedroom. My eldest son John had constant nightmares, saying there was a lady talking to him when he was falling asleep, and that his bed covers were changing colour. He was so distressed that I swapped rooms with the boys. The back bedroom had a horrible thick feeling in the air, and quite hard to describe it, not nice at all. I suffer from sleep paralysis, and I hadn't had it in a long time, but I seem to have it nightly in that house. My husband worked offshore at the time, and I was there alone with the boys most of the time. There were always strange and very loud bangs and noises, and my kettle used to turn on and off by itself on a daily basis. Also, putrid smells now and again that would disappear on their own. I spoke to one of my neighbours about my kettle, and she told me that I carried a presence with me wherever I went. We moved shortly after that. My father-in-law was at school with Virginia Campbell, and he told me that he remembered the desk lifting up and down in the classroom. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago, and I can't get any more information from him. Yes, of course you can use these comments, and I don't mind my name being used or any of my sons. Many thanks, Nicola Bernard.
Malcolm was fascinated by this, as it does seem to challenge the idea that everything was hinged to Virginia herself, even down to the wild detail about the bed sheets changing colour. That was something, if you remember, had happened to the Campbell family when they lived in the house in 1960, and it's a feature that neither Malcolm Robinson or indeed I have ever heard in any other poltergeist case. Bed sheets changing colour. It's wild. Yet here we have 2 separate people across decades saying they saw the same phenomena, and what's the link? It happened in the same house. The mystery deepened even further when Malcolm was contacted by a man called David MacDonald. David explained that in late 1969, his mother moved into number 17 Park Crescent. Now, the Campbell's haunting had happened at number 19, remember? So 17 is the next house up. You know, we've got odd numbers and even numbers on opposite sides here and streets, and so the numbers jump 1. Well, did the presence jump 2? Because David MacDonald's mum said that during her 14 years of living at number 17, she too had strange paranormal experiences. The doors would open and close on their own. The plugs would fly out of the wall sockets, and the family kept hearing the sound of what seemed like mice behind the furniture. Remember, on the first night of the activity, Virginia and Margaret had rushed downstairs saying that there was a mouse in their room, but there wasn't. Same thing here. It sounded like mice, only there were no mice, no evidence of mice anywhere. David MacDonald also said that he would sleepwalk while he lived in that house, and that he had an imaginary friend while there. He believed this imaginary friend was somehow connected to the haunting on that street. This was creepy, listen. Sometimes his mother would hear noise from outside her house, number 17, in the middle of the night. She would get up, confused at what the noise was, and she would look out the window, and there was her son, her young son, David, out there in the front garden. He was playing in his sleep with his so-called imaginary friend, playing in the dead of night, right in front of both 17 and 19. Imaginary friends and the paranormal is an intriguing topic, and after this I suggest that you check out my episode that shares chilling cases on that subject. Well, Malcolm asked for permission to call David's mum, and he said yes, and she confirmed that she absolutely believed that there had been poltergeist activity at number 17. She had witnessed it with her own eyes. She confirmed the stories of plugs just leaping out of the sockets, of strange clawing and scratching noises that they could never explain. She said how they searched for signs of rats or mice droppings, things like that. They found nothing. She said they even would hear the floorboards creaking like someone was walking around the house, even though there was nobody there in the house to make those sounds, unless, of course, it was a spectral neighbor paying a visit. David's auntie said she always felt a sense of doom and dread in the house, and she certainly refused to stay in number 17 on account of how the place made her feel. Malcolm asked David's mum if she was aware of the stories from 1960 of the poltergeist that happened in number 19. Well, remember, she moved in almost 10 years later, and so she said she wasn't aware of the stories. Indeed, she said if she had been, there was no way she would have moved next door to it. Her frightening experiences started within about a week or two of moving in. And then when she started thinking about it and asking about it, well, eventually she found out what had happened next door, and it chilled her. Malcolm was also astonished to discover news of another poltergeist case on Park Crescent, only this time at number 30. A report from the year 2000 in the Wee County News said that the Maxwell family had been hounded out of their home by a sinister presence. It started with mysterious noises and objects in the house moving on their own. They could even hear a baby crying, and cupboard doors would fly open at night. This got so intense, in fact, that they had to nail a cupboard door shut, but it still managed to fling itself open. Mandy even said that the unseen forces had thrown her across the room and even pushed her down the stairs. She had the bruises on her body to show for it. They had all since moved the family into one single bedroom. The father of the family, James Maxwell, said this to the newspaper.
6 of us are sleeping in the same room because of what's been happening in the other bedrooms. The Waynes are too scared to get up to go to the toilet at night. I've been on to Paragon House and we're getting moved somewhere else, but they say there is nothing they can do. I've also been on to an estate agent about getting rented accommodation, but they've not got anything suitable for us. We've told Paragon that we would be prepared to take the kids out of school and move out of the district if it meant they would be safe.
Mandy claimed to see a dark figure standing in the house. She described it as semi-transparent, and interestingly, she said it would appear to ripple like water, just like Virginia's bedclothes had done so 40 years before. Some of the reporters at the Wee News assumed this must have happened in the same house as the 1960 Sauchie Poltergeist, but Malcolm, along with fellow researcher Brian Allen, looked into this properly and confirmed that these events with the Maxwell family were occurring in number 30, not at number 17, or definitely not at number 19 either. Brian Allen followed up the newspaper report and investigated the Maxwell's case. They confirmed the details of the report, but also shared more information about things in the house. The children, for example, would be terrified when seeing a dark, shadowy figure moving around in the hallway. The youngest child had a name for this figure. He called it the monster. He'd run in to his parents and tell them, "Mummy, Mummy, Daddy, look, the monster is back in the hallway." Brian Allen brought in a team to do an on-site investigation overnight. Nothing remarkable happened, and yet he was still intrigued by their claims. And it is just another suggestion that what was happening in 1960 could have been emanating from Virginia Campbell, but what if it was coming from the street itself? Well, one of the most pressing questions in all of this is what happened to Virginia. We know that she moved out of number 19, but where did she go? And would she be willing to share her experience with researchers? Well, Malcolm was desperate to track her down. He tried all sorts of avenues, but it was only in 2020 when he managed to get some new information on her from a lady called Daisy Watson. Daisy was able to fill in some of the blanks. Virginia had moved from Scotland to Bedfordshire, and she ended up living in Kempston, which joins up geographically with the larger town of Bedford. She and Mary became friends, and Daisy told Malcolm that the activity had even followed Virginia to Bedfordshire. You see, it appears that they moved into a flat or apartment when they moved down south, and Daisy had said funny things happened in that flat for about a month or two, but then it just seemed to die out. And it never came back, it seems. She also said that Virginia's parents died in Bedford and that Virginia still lives in the area. Yet from the sounds of it, she is not particularly keen to discuss what happened to her. Why should she? It's her life. But it does leave us with a truly compelling case of what appears to be the paranormal in full display in front of countless witnesses. Did the events come from Virginia? Like this was some form of psychokinesis, or was it from outside of her, like a haunting? Malcolm Robinson does not believe that cases like this can be put down to some powerful external force coming from children just because they're going through puberty. That's a common idea that you might hear, but for him, he is not particularly impressed with that idea. He suggests that if that's true, then millions of teenagers are going through puberty at any one time, so surely we'd have this sort of activity all over the place. Instead, he says,
My belief, not just for the Sauchie case, but for all other poltergeist cases, is that we are dealing with a discarnate entity that has passed on, has not moved forward, and is trying to draw attention to itself by hanging around the earth plane, causing mischief and havoc. My view may not sit well with my fellow researchers, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, it's what I believe.
What do you believe? Were all those witnesses mistaken? Every single one of them? And if they weren't, what was the nature of the supernatural events that terrorized Sauchie back in 1960? This case is startling, so much so that some may simply be unable to even comprehend it could be true, no matter how many witnesses say they saw it. Perhaps we should leave the final word to an author that Malcolm helpfully quotes in the book.
It is perfectly possible that children have more paranormal experiences, not because they are gullible and have yet to learn what they should properly believe, but rather because they are open-minded and perceptive and have yet to be taught what they must disbelieve.
I'm Peter Laws, and if you live in Sauchie, particularly if you're on Park Crescent, get in touch if you have any more details of activity either in the past or indeed currently. Because who's to say that whatever lived in number 19 and 17 and 30 might not be wandering that street looking for another number in which to play in. But for now, you've been listening to Sauchie 1960, Scotland's unmatched poltergeist case. Good night.